Republican National Committee Chairman Michael Steele criticized President Obama recently for pursuing the war in Afghanistan. He was roundly denounced by members of his own party. There was one notable exception, Congressman Ron Paul. The former presidential candidate has also joined with Congressman Barney Frank in calling for a reduction in military spending as a way to reduce the budget deficit. The congressman now joins me via phone to discuss both of these topics. Welcome, Congressman. Thanks for being with us. I note that as far back as January of 2009, you wrote something in which you said Afghanistan will be Obama's war. That was essentially what Michael Steele was saying, wasn't it?
That is right. And you know, the criticism he got for this is just political rhetoric, because, you know, a president is the commander-in-chief, and everybody knows what we're talking about or knows what he was talking about. You know, when the Vietnam War shifted one president to the next, I mean, Kennedy escalated or got it going, and Johnson escalated more. It became Johnson's war, and Obama has identified himself with this war as being the good war, and he's made the strongest argument for more spending and more troops over there. So it really is, in a political sense, very realistically, Obama's war.
And the other thing for which Mr. Steele got in trouble was saying that it was sort of historical folly to get into a land war in Afghanistan. That's something you would agree with as well.
Oh, absolutely. I think everybody knows that. For somebody to argue that historical point, I think they lose credibility, because it's been known, not for 100 years, but thousands of years, people just don't go into that country and occupy it, and they like to be left alone. I mean, they have their problems, but they'd like to take care of their own problems, and Afghanistan, they believe, is for Afghans, not for foreign occupiers, and they certainly expressed that view in the 1980s when we allied ourselves with Osama bin Laden and the Mujahideen and said, hey, look, you Soviets and Russians, you need to go home. Problem is we're back doing the same thing that we objected to back in the 80s.
But now Michael Steele got into some hot water. As I mentioned, everybody, or a lot of Republicans, came out and went after him, called for his resignation. He has backed away from these remarks and now has said he fully supports the mission. What do you see sort of at play here in the reaction to his remarks, and what does it say about your party?
Well, I think it says that politics, is politics, and this is what's happening. You make a statement, you overstate something, or you just blurt out the truth, and then somebody deems it politically incorrect or not acceptable, then people do back away from it. But I think the only thing I'm seeking is the truth, and he blurted out the truth, and I think not only was he speaking, from his heart and what he really believed in, I think he's with the American people. I think the Democratic base is very unhappy with Obama. The progressives don't like the foreign policy. And I think the Republicans are much more opposed to what's going on right now in Afghanistan than we get to hear about. So I think it's a very healthy discussion. But I also understand the politics of it all.
How much, when you're back at home, do you hear about the war? I mean, when people are coming up to you and talking about issues, what's number one on their mind? Is the war in Afghanistan something they bring up a lot?
No, I wish they'd bring it up more, but it's high on the list. But I think the economy still is the big one, and and oil spills. But it doesn't take me long to get their attention on this, because when we talk about states trying to combat oil spills, I talk about why are there guard units over in the foreign countries, and if you're worrying about borders, why are we worrying about borders over there around the world when we don't worry about our own? So all of a sudden, they do pay attention, and I think they're starting to realize too that these expenditures are a detriment to our domestic economy, and I think that's the reason why Barney Frank and I have gotten a lot of attention from both liberals and conservatives, that this excessive spending, it may well be easier to cut overseas spending than it is to cut these domestic programs, and that's been my position. That's where we should start. It's a lot easier politically to cut overseas spending and war spending than it is to cut programs that I might not even endorse, but I'm not anxious to put them at the top of the list for cutting here at home.
Well, let's talk about that proposal with Congressman Frank. Give us just the brief outlines. How much are we talking about in terms of savings here?
Well, it's not enough for me, but I know we have to start someplace, and we, Barney and I, came to an agreement that we would deal with some of the most egregious ways we spend money overseas, and that is what we see as foreign aid to rich countries, where we provide their national defense. Why do we subsidize the Germans and the Japanese and the South Koreans by providing all their national defense? And we didn't, on purpose, get into the more difficult discussion about the Afghan war. But we want to save money by cutting out some of the weapon systems and bringing troops home. And we had some experts look into this and believe that, if we did what they're suggesting, what we agree with is that we could save $1 trillion over the next 10 years.
And that's $1 trillion, and you think that it won't require what would it require in terms of American national security priorities? What would fall off the table to get that $1 trillion?
Well, it would be some weapons history and troops at home, but I think we'd be a lot more secure, because I see that an interventionist foreign policy is our greatest danger, because that is why people get very annoyed with us. The intervention of the Soviets in Afghanistan brought them down for economic reasons and no military victory. So I see this as very damaging to us, to be in so many places either subsidizing rich countries or fighting no-win wars. I mean, we are not winning the war in Afghanistan. Matter of fact, they don't even pretend, the military and the politicians don't even say that we can have a military victory. So there's not even a pretense. We still have violence in the green zone in Iraq, and people are still getting killed there, and they still don't have a government, and they're still pretending we're going to be out of there in a couple months. But I think what Obama has done, which is misleading, he tries to appease his base by saying, "Oh, we're going to be out of Afghanistan next year." Then he tries to neutralize the hawks on the right by saying, "Oh, let's have more troops in there. Let's aggravate it. Let's make the war bigger. Let's go into Pakistan and Yemen." At the same time, he says we're going to end it all next year. But that's the way the politicians work. They try to appease everybody, and we end up with a foreign policy which is hodgepodge and gets us into more trouble, and I think less secure.
Let me ask you, you talked about those European countries. Are you talking about changing our relationship with NATO, or is that not something you would
yeah, I don't believe we should be in NATO. NATO was set up in 1949 to counteract the Soviet system. Even then, one of my favorite politicians, Robert Taft, said that we shouldn't even be in it. And that was in the 40s, just when the Cold War was really roaring. So no, we shouldn't be in there. They drain us, and then they drag us into war. And it's supposedly NATO is fighting, the war in Afghanistan. I mean, what does that mean? Is that what the purpose of NATO, to get into nation building in Afghanistan? I think there's always economic motivations behind this, whether it's oil, gas pipelines, or natural resources that are involved. But NATO, we shouldn't be in NATO, and just being out of NATO would save us a lot of money. In terms of
the places that the federal budget can be cut, did you start with the Pentagon spending because you thought it was the easiest target? Because a lot of people would say, in discretionary spending, if you include defense in that, you're really not talking about the big problems, which are the entitlements. What's your reaction to that?
Well, the entitlements are a big problem, but that doesn't mean the Pentagon isn't a small one. To maintain what we're doing militarily, if you add up everything, there's been studies that show that we're spending over $1 trillion a year, so that's not a small amount. But I'm willing to cut a lot more, probably more than I can get Barney Frank to agree to. But this is a start as far as I'm concerned, that we can come up and come together on an important amount of money. But we also should, cut back domestically. My goal would be to follow the Constitution and get rid of all the programs not authorized. But I also know that's not going to happen unless we go totally bankrupt. Then we're not going to be able to finance our military or the welfare at home, and that's going to be a tragedy compared to the hardship of cutting back.
A couple more questions, Congressman. Back on the Michael Steele question. Do you think he's a good leader for the party?
Well, compared to whom? I would say that he's not as bad as what they're talking about. He doesn't deserve to be put out. I would say that we're doing okay on winning our elections. It looks good for November. Some of the people criticizing him and jumping on him and want to divide the party, and they're described as Republican leaders, say such and such. I would say I certainly don't want them leading the party, because right now they're being divisive and say, oh, let's jump on Steele for him accidentally speaking out the truth. So no, compared to those individuals who declare themselves Republican leaders who demand his resignation, I would say he's doing a great job.
And why do you think the Republican Party is going to do well this election season?
I wish I could say it's because they're true believers and they believe in the Constitution, limited government civil liberties, and a good foreign policy. But the truth is Republicans are going to do well because the Democrats are doing so poorly. But it's also the reason why the Tea Party movement is so strong, because there's still a lot of skepticism about the Republicans. They're not fully trusted. They had their chance. They made the deficits worse. They pursued war. Actually, the warmongering going on in the Middle East and Iraq was part of the reason we lost in 2006 and 2008. But the Republicans, are good in opposition. They're saying the right things. They want to be fiscal conservatives, but they still have a long way to go to prove themselves. But in spite of all the Republican shortcomings, they're likely to do very well, mainly because the Democrats are doing so poorly.
Final question, Congressman, your son is obviously one of those candidates running. And I just wondered, given that you went through the crucible of the presidential race and you've been through these kind of hothouse moments where suddenly the phone's ringing and everybody is saying this and that about you, what advice did you give him before he entered into the white-hot spotlight of that race?
Probably very little. I mean, he made his decision and let me know about it, and he's been involved in politics for a long time. He's had his taxpayers groups, even when he was a medical student and a resident in North Carolina. Then he had a taxpayers group in Kentucky, so he's been very interested, and he toyed with the idea, and once Jim Bunning got out, that's when he decided to run. But I never gave him any particular advice on those issues.
And how's his race going?
Best I can tell, very well, and I'm not involved on a day-to-day basis, but his polling looks like it's very favorable.
All right. Congressman Ron Paul, thank you so much for being with us.
You're welcome. Good to talk to you.
That's the census. The goal is to count every person